consciousness is part of the physical world. It's an emergent property of the structure of the brain and neurons. It's not a special magic dust or anything, or a signal to be received by a radio in the brain's the receiver. So yeah, I pretty much agree with him on most things. I'm excited to get a little bit more into the meaning parts of things. That's what I'm looking forward to in the final bits. Yeah.
I kind of concur with that.
Cool.
You know what? I don't...
Go ahead.
I'll be right back, sorry. I just realized I want my notes on this, because I took a bunch of notes on things I want to talk about, but I don't have them, so I'll be right back.
No, I really enjoyed his free will, because I think it really, if I was articulate, that's how I would sound.
Every time I read someone like that, I'm like, why can't I just speak like this all the time? It's so true. Like, I'm very sympathetic. I can see how, for instance, DJ, we make the switch from being a hard-nosed determinist to switching to compatibilism, because I can see the just basically all the same logical steps that we require, and he even mentions this. I think Carroll even says, look, it's a boring discussion at the end of the day between a capitalist and a determinist, because it's basically just how you define the terms and whether they're useful or not. It's not about the underlying core idea about whether libertarian free will exists or not.
Right. Like you said, Harry, it's all about how you define free will. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yet for some reason, when you listen to some discussions about it, there seems to be a lot at stake, and I guess that's the way a lot of philosophy is.
Yes, yeah. But sometimes we need to keep in mind, though, that we're speaking to people, and that I know I've become much more soporific now when I have discussions with people. I'd much rather love come first than truth, and I'm in a little bit of a transition when it comes to that. Whereas before, I might have really wanted to be right in the conversation. I'm trying to let go of that a bit more and just explore the landscape with the individual as a team rather than as a combatant.
Yay!
I suppose that's at the heart of truth epistemology, right? That's kind of the perspective, which is you're there to understand what they're doing, they're all truth epistemology. Yeah, I found that quite interesting.
I had to look up the word soporific, Harry, because I wasn't familiar with that term, and I got the definition: boring or dull. I would not use that to describe you, Harry.
I want to see whether I've got the word wrong then. What's the definition say?
Well, basically, it's sleep-inducing.
I thought soporific was not sleepy, but instead was about being kind of gentle. So you guys learned something new today.
It could be just another use of the word.
To be fair, I stole it off my mum, and often she creates her own little definitions of words. So I've got plenty of those in my language.
Now, was anybody frightened by the novel that was mentioned, "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress," where some computer becomes self-aware? Isn't that kind of scary?
Yes. Oh yeah, the Mike.
Yeah.
I actually kind of want to read that book now.
Yes.
Yeah, Minecraft. Ooh. That was a great book, I thought.
You read it?
Oh yeah, and Robert Heinlein, I've read all of it.
there a take-home message from it, juggling?
Oh, probably several. First of all, is that if you create a penal colony, you are gonna have a revolution. The second one is that the moon is the high ground in any battle because with just a little bit of effort, you can drop something that has an extraordinary effect on the others.
Oh yeah, I see what you mean. Because if you're using physical projectiles, then you don't have gravity to contend with in the same way. And the penal colony one, I guess England learned that the hard way.
With Australia?
I'm betting Australia was one of the success stories.
I mean, it depends because at the moment I don't know how well it's being governed nor how well they're tackling some of the larger existential issues. But they're certainly a nice bunch of people.
Yeah.
What did you think of these? Because you've already read the book, haven't you, Juggling now? I mean, you said that you just listened to it on audio. So did you
Yeah.
go back over it?
I did some, but it was just going over it again.
Do you agree with kind of Sean's perspective?
I don't even agree with him about MWI. I'm not sure if I heard him even state a philosophical position about free will that I could agree or disagree.
He does his one's compatibilism.
Yeah. It seemed like maybe it's okay. I'm a bit of an anti-determinist, so maybe that's my problem. I don't think that determinism can withstand the randomnesses that we see in quantum theory and in radioactive.
He does think that though.
Yeah.
Does he think that? He thinks that even radioactive decay can be considered determined?
No, he basically thinks that it doesn't make sense to talk about it in that way because we can determine with almost 100, like the error bars around radioactive decay in action are so tiny that it doesn't make any effect in terms of free will. So quantum states are kind of about probability, and when you get to a higher emergent level, like we can predict to 99.99% accuracy where a ball's going and how things are going to interact, and so you can start to get that certainty. And we know that in social science, right? You test enough people, you have high enough population size, you can start to get certainties in like the 70% range about how people act in accordance with a different situation, or how a physical system like our health changes according to an environmental property. So at this emergent level, but I agree with him. That's why I'm defending his position. At that emergent level, we have very high degrees of predictability. So determinism seems to make sense, at least for the first 95 to 99% accurate prediction.
But I think, according to many worlds theory, how Sean Carroll would describe radioactive decay is the atom both decays and it does not decay, and those possibilities are all in a superposition that never collapses. So all of the things that we consider possibilities are part of an actual universe, but inaccessible to us.
Yeah.
So, this is, I suppose, a little bit of a general comment over the book, but I found his writing style really irritating at times because I couldn't, he would state positions in a kind of offhanded way, and it was very hard for me to understand if he was stating his own position or somebody else's, and I found that really hard to keep up with because he would just kind of offhandedly, and he wouldn't do so in a way that let me know his own position that he was taking. And so I
Yeah.
just kept going, does he really believe that? And then I would have to reread, and then, oh, maybe he doesn't because he's also saying this. Okay, well, geez. So I found that really hard to deal with.
Having listened to him kind of debate and talk about his positions, I kind of knew what I was getting into. So I found I understand what you mean by that language, but because I already kind of partly knew what his philosophical positions were, I didn't have time passing between him explaining a different position than his own position. But I could actually see now how that would be frustrating if you weren't familiar with his positions in the first place.
I guess the part that annoys me the most about his writing is he keeps talking about certain things being useful. Useful to adopt a certain perspective. And so I keep thinking, okay, is this a useful fiction or is it useful because it's real? And I can't seem to nail him down on which position he holds there.
He doesn't define what he means by that until like chapter 47. Let's see if I can find it. Oh wait, we're not covering that section. Well, basically, he finally says that by useful he means that we can make predictions with it. But in the context, it's funny. Me and Harry were just talking about this. In the context, that doesn't always seem appropriate. So I would have used something like livable, meaning can I live my life this way, or will I just end up hating on everyone around me and destroying lives? You know, that kind of thing. That seems a more, quote, useful way of thinking of, quote, usefulness.
I think he would take, yes. I get the impression that he much more leans into the hard truth Paris camp rather than the metaphorical truth Peterson camp when it comes to what's useful. So I get the impression that he's much more along the lines of truth and usefulness at its bare bones of its underlying structure is about what's predictable and what is actually going on within the natural world, rather than what makes us happy. But I'm prepared to be corrected if he says differently than he says differently.
Well, and I guess this is slightly off topic, but I would just argue that the idea of livable is neither about scientific usefulness nor about symbology, but it's about it's practical. It's it's the embodiment of all our ideas down into the moment as I'm trying to live my life with my family or the people around me. How does everything work together in a way that allows me to live my life well or not? And I think you have to get back to that gestalt at some point.
Yeah, I think that's default. Personally, I think that is the underlying thing that should undergirl everything.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it just has no. I just don't care if it doesn't. It just because it doesn't affect how I live and how I interact with people and whether I'm happy or not. And it seems that these conscious states are all that I can and should care about.
Right.
I guess what I'm concerned about is more of what does usefulness tell us about what is reality? Like, if something is useful, does that necessarily mean that it corresponds to some aspect of reality? Or is there such a thing as a useful fiction, and how do we tell the difference?
Yeah, I think it's Brett Weinstein talks about useful. He says that you could have useful falsehoods, like porcupines can fire their spine, and so people will make sure that they are, they steer clear, like really clear of porcupines, so they don't come any close, and that's a useful fiction because they don't try and test or take that risk, and so they may more likely survive and pass on their genes because they think that porcupines can fire their spines when in reality they can't, and so it might be a useful fiction there, but it's still a fiction. And then I think that then there's a counter point to that, which is that actually knowing that they can't fire their spines is immensely useful, and how you use that information that's important. So it means that in times of absolute dire straits, maybe you do need to hunt and kill a porcupine, and so how you go about doing that, you need to know its behavior and its biology, and so understanding more of the world means that you can act in more appropriate ways that can help with your survival.
I just did a quick search of the ebook, and he uses the word useful more than 100 times throughout the book.
So I don't know how off topic this is to follow this rabbit trail of how do we useful fictions, but I feel inclined to do so. Um, I happen to think that there are things that might be fictions for which we will never know whether they are fictions or not. And so what I am interested in clearing out beliefs that can be established if they are fictions, but there are also beliefs that I don't think we can, and I would suggest that those areas are areas which are kind of up for grabs. It's kind of like, do you want to experiment with this idea or not? Is it useful to you? Well, only you can tell. And so that's the way I would think about that.
3XK is typing in the book club chat. Isn't quote unquote useful something like the way to conceptualize something that makes predictions so it can be potentially falsified?
Yes, I think that would be Carroll's perspective. We'll take on it.
Well, let me quote from the book, because I think this is where he kind of got into kind of a real life example of free will. He says the concept of choice does exist, and it would be difficult indeed to describe human beings without it. Imagine you're a high school student who wants to go to college and you've been accepted into several universities. You look at their web pages, visit campuses, talk to students and faculty at each place. Then you say to one of them, no to the others. And what is the best way to describe what just happened? The most useful vocabulary for talking about our human scale world. It would inevitably involve some statements along the lines of, you made a choice, and the reasons for that choice. If you had been a simplistic robot or a random number generator, there might have been a better way of talking, but it is artificial and counterproductive to deny ourselves the vocabulary of choice when we talk about human beings, regardless of how well we understand the laws of physics. Anybody disagree with what he was getting there, or agree?
I mean, I think I disagree in the sense that I'm not a compatibilist, so I think that use the word choice actually brings up all kinds of different minefields, and it doesn't help us construct a proper moral framework and a framework of true justice. So I do kind of disagree with our concepts around that. That's why I'm sort of like determinist. But I ultimately agree with his poetic naturalism that there are ways of talking about things that make sense at certain emergent levels, and at that emergent level there will be a different type of vocabulary when it comes to discussing what happens within departments compared to what happens to particles.
He does talk about our limits to our knowledge having something to do with our seeing possible choices ahead of us. And I agree with that. I see choices being, we have some sort of mental representation of possible futures, and then we act according to that representation of possible futures. It doesn't mean that all of those futures are possible, just that we have some representation of that in our mind when we make a choice.
And I guess the complexity of the process is part of that too, because the example Steven Pinker gives is, if I shine a light in your eye and your pupils constrict, you really didn't make a choice to constrict your pupils. Whereas or at least we don't say that. And usually when someone does choose a university over other possible universities, we do say that they've made a choice. And so that's because we think there's more of a deliberative process going on. Maybe more parts of the brain are involved in the so-called decision or choice.
Yeah, it's a different type of calculation, and it's important to recognise that it's a different type of calculation because it will fundamentally affect their future behaviour, and therefore we'll know how to interact with their behaviour on that level. So it's important to distinguish.
The thing is with choice, I mean, if you break down what a choice is, what's going on at the reductive level, it's a type of deliberation. And whether we call it libertarianly free or determined, there's still a process that you have to go through. There's still a chain of thinking that you have to go to through that. To me, looks the same whether you call it libertarianly free or compatibilist free. So it's still it's a useful concept because you're still doing it. You still have to go through it. If people think, oh, it's determined, I don't have to think. It's just I'm just doing. I'm just doing, I guess, without any kind of conscious deliberation. That's not true in any sense. If you have to, when we're thinking about free will, we have to think about it has to fit our phenomenology. Like it has to fit what's actually going on. What we're actually doing. It's not that we're changing what we're doing by whether we consider it free or not. Does that make sense?
I have to go, but my final comment would be that I think that the way that we do think about it in terms of, so we've got this, obviously it always opens up a broader conversation about freedom and liberty and how we think about how to judge people and whether people actually make a choice, or like in terms of libertarian sense, whether or not. I think for me it's about the difference between libertarian and combativism and kind of more even more kind of determinist framework is that I think that they are making a calculation, and that calculation will always equal the same because the inputs are the same. So they couldn't have done otherwise. There is no way that they could have done otherwise with the universe being ordered in the way that it is. And that just seems to emerge out of the fact that we have 6 physical properties and laws of the universe. And so it's important to recognize that within our language when we're talking about that at that certain level. So that's why I prefer to stick to a determinist, because I think that it hints towards that deeper foundational layer of if you have a certain biology and you create a certain environment, people will act a certain way. And they cannot fight against their biology and their environment. They are reactive. They have an action that is basically spawned from a whole load of precepts. That would be my final comment on it.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us, Harry.
Thank you, guys. Might be online later to chat a bit more.
All right, have a good day.
So I hate to go into this after you.
What some of the folks who are opposed to the use of the term free will or choice might be getting at is, someone like Sam Harris, in a conversation he had with Sean Carroll, he didn't want to take credit for himself getting a PhD in neuroscience because his feeling was he didn't choose his gene.
Check.
And that is responsible. Those are responsible for him getting the PhD in neuroscience. And similarly, he doesn't want to necessarily blame somebody for being Saddam Hussein because Saddam Hussein didn't choose his genes or his environment, and so the way he is was just he could be no other way. So I think there's a certain there's a belief that if you start using terms like free will and choice, that we would end up taking a retributive attitude towards other people that we can avoid if we stop using those terms.
Yeah, I definitely think there's some value in that, but I'm not sure we can do away with the language of choice and responsibility. I not to toot my own horn here, but I just tried to put out a video about my views on this, and I guess I would say that where's the Carroll? Carroll is talking about the System 1 and System 2 and how the chariot is giving too much credibility, so it's more like an elephant on a rider on an elephant, and the rider is just being aware of what the elephant is doing and making up excuses for why what's happening is happening. I guess that's not his idea. That's what's his name?
Jonathan Haidt.
Jonathan Haidt. Yes, thank you. So I would say yes, but it seems fairly clear that the rider is doing something. The rider is having a feedback loop with the elephant. And the more self-aware that awareness can be by making a model of the elephant, if you will, then the rider can begin training the elephant. And so that is only a degree of freedom. It's not absolute freedom to control everything you're doing. But nevertheless, it seems an accurate way of describing what people are able to do. Otherwise, counseling and, self-improvement, these would have no meaning. If it wasn't for me going, okay, I'm going to, I'm aware of doing that. It's an awareness that probably does emerge from the elephant, but it's because I'm aware of it that I'm doing it. If I wasn't aware, I wouldn't be doing it. So there is a feedback loop, and there is a role to be played. And if we don't have the language to describe that, then we're just missing the reality a lot of people are living in and moving in. And I think that's more problematic than than what you were saying before about, are we overly blaming people for where they are? Well, yes, there's a sense in which we can't blame people who are not in a situation to become more self-aware because they are ideologically possessed or that kind of thing. But we can figure out how to, if you will, hopefully we can figure out how to upload more self-awareness into those individuals so that they can begin becoming self-aware and making better choices. That's the hope, at least.
You should also note that blame plays a role in, again, in that positive function in terms of helping us figure out our actions as well. So it's not like, I agree, we should temper blame. We shouldn't become vengeful. I'm always very cautious about calling people evil versus figuring out how to improve the situation. But punishment plays a role in the deliberative process and making our choices. Oh, I will be punished forms part of my thought chain in should I do this action. So again, it's all, there are real choices that are being made, I think, no matter how, whether we call it free or not.
So I would go so far as to say that computers can make choices, and you can have reinforcement learning for a computer, which isn't quite as harsh as what we think of punishment for conscious creatures, but a way of giving it negative feedback to cause it to change its calculations in the future.
So I wouldn't deny something like that. I would say that there are differences of degree. I mean, I do think it might be possible for us to one day create a, computer person, if you will, a computer that functions in every way parallel to a human. But I certainly don't think we're there yet.
And we have Star Trek to thank for us exploring the ideas well before we can.
Absolutely.
Yeah, how about that?
Yeah, I love science fiction and fantasy for their capacity to let us do all kinds of thought experiments.
So in the case of determinism, if we assume that free will is not nearly as free as we assume, that leaves a lot for the question of how we deal with criminals in our society. It seems like there are several motivations. One would be protecting society, another one would be rehabilitating people, another one is something like justice and vengeance. And I think that last one, if we get rid of free will, we could maybe get people to drop the last part of that, the justice, the vengeance thing.
I don't know. Because if we really are as determined as, if we really are as obeying the laws of physics as we think, can we even get rid of that vengeful part of our atomic structure?
Well, if we can change the variables going into the calculation, then we should be able to change it. And in this case, the variables are just how people think about the question.
I think, though, the notion of vengeance and the desire for vengeance is so rooted, emotionally and in our psyche, it would be a difficult thing to get rid of that.
as Brett was saying, maybe we could temper it because we don't want vengeance, but we do want social, like even social ostracism, where someone feels a sense of shame for something they've done because other members of the group, have lower their attitudes toward that person. That's a form of that's not vengeance, but it does model, it does influence behavior. And if we were simply to say, well, that person acted that way and they couldn't help it, the person who's acting improperly, as we see it, might be able to anticipate that reaction, the reaction that people are going to just kind of let that go, not respond, and therefore engage in that behavior more frequently. Whereas if that person were to anticipate social ostracism or some sort of scolding or whatever, then maybe they say, well, I won't do that anymore. So I think I agree that the vengeance part. I'm agreeing with Brett because we don't want to remove all of the causative influences of the idea of choice, but we do want to temper it.
I would say that these are primarily issues of social and economic infrastructure, because I think the question is, perhaps we can do away with vengeance, but we have to have a society that is able to support that and that is able to instill that, and is so, like, for instance, if there is a complete technological collapse and we're all back to farming and we're struggling just to survive, there's not going to be enough resources to do imprisonment and perhaps even to a degree what do you call it when you try to turn a person good from being bad? The word's escaping my mind, but rehabilitate. Thank you. So, I often speculate when I'm reading the Bible and what seems incredibly harsh to us, and I'm like, well, okay, yeah, but they didn't have industrialization. They had limited resources. Are we really holding them to our standards now, or was there a sense in which that had to be the case because there just wasn't the resources to not, get rid of the person who is continually causing problems, that kind of thing. So all that to say that I think if we really want a society in which all crime is rehabilitated, that is not a question of ethics so much as a question of, is it physically possible for us to get there and make that society?
It's quite possible to get rid of all crime, just remove all of them. It's not a satisfactory solution.
I think it would be as difficult as getting rid of anger. You've got a very primal, instinctive human desire to enact revenge, when there's a feeling that you've been wronged.
That's one thing that Steven Pinker mentioned in a discussion with Daniel Dennett and Joshua Green is that the reason why our criminal justice system might include some aspect of vengeance in it, even if we're enlightened enough to think that that's not a good thing. Well, some people are enlightened enough not to think that's a good thing, but is because you want the population as a whole to have confidence in the justice system, and they may lose confidence in it if there isn't some pound of flesh taken in certain circumstances. And you need buy-in from everybody to accept that this is the I suppose that really gets down to the next layer, which is if you educate people about determinism versus free will, then maybe people won't demand the pound of flesh. But as DJ was saying, maybe that's utopian.
I just don't think rational education is enough to overcome what is a very basic instinct. I mean, maybe you can manage it, but it's not something we'd be able to get rid of without maybe excising some parts of the brain. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with that. Management is kind of the best way you appear to be able to do. It's kind of funny. I should probably stop talking. I've been talking a lot, but there's a guy that wandered into another Discord channel I've been on recently, and he would be very cordial and interesting for a while, and then he would start kind of trying to push people into a corner that would basically irritate them. And I was like, why is this guy suddenly being a jerk? Like, is this just a really advanced troll? What's going on? And I finally got him in a private message and was going through, and he's basically got some sort of philosophy of you have to show people the anger within them so that they will be motivated to. I'm totally putting words in his mouth. He didn't say this, but put them in a corner and show them their evil so that they're motivated to get out of that position. And I'm like, that seems like a really twisted way of doing it, but okay.
I could see that in a martial arts class with some kind of warning and buy-in ahead of time. I think walking into a room and doing that to people without telling them that's your intention seems...
I couldn't agree more.
Well, what did you guys think about the first chapter in this section, which is titled Crawling into Consciousness? Maybe I'll quote some part of it. Let's see. This is about 400 million years ago, a plucky little fish climbed onto land and decided to hang out rather than returning to the sea. And then it goes on. I guess one of the things he mentioned that I found interesting was that if you spend much time swimming or diving, you know that you can't see very far underwater as you can in the air. The attenuation length, the distance past which light is mostly absorbed by the medium you're looking through, is tens of meters of clear water, while in air it's practically infinite. And that has a dramatic effect on how you think. So he makes the point that once some distant ancestor of ours crawled onto land, they could see further, and therefore the incentive structure and the environmental conditions were different, and that maybe led to larger brains. I don't know. I'm trying to summarize what he's saying there in that chapter.
I'm not sure I like the theory because it seems to imply that fish are not conscious, and it seems like an explanation for things we already know, but I'm not sure how you would test it since we don't have a good theory to distinguish between which animals are conscious and which aren't right now.
How about if it didn't change consciousness, but leave consciousness on a sliding scale? And we could replicate the test by raising the animals in environments where they can see far and environments where they can't see far, and see if they have a difference in brain development.
But he goes on to talk about mammals who have returned to the ocean, but yet have not lost these cognitive abilities. So even if you put animals into a case where they can't see very far, they still seem to have these higher order brain functions.
Yeah, they have the advantage of, while they can't necessarily see as far, they can hear crazy far. So, and that was not something Tiktaalik, as far as I can tell, I don't think I have any reason to think Tiktaalik had any We actually have an interesting test in the Yangtze River dolphins, where their sonar has been drowned out by the diesel traffic on that river. I wonder if we could know anything from that.
What was that? I didn't quite catch it.
Yangtze River is in China, and there's a type of dolphin that lives in there, and that the river is very cloudy, you can't see very far, and now the noise of the diesel traffic, the boats on that river, have drowned out where the dolphins can't hear each other anymore. They're pretty deafened, and that would be an interesting. Maybe there's a natural experiment there where we could look at the Yangtze dolphins and see if they're having a cognitive decline because they can no longer see or hear any farther than short range.
Wow, you just depressed me.
I don't think we're going to understand animal consciousness until we understand our own consciousness, because the ability to have subjective experiences is not something that you can test from the outside. So it's going to have to involve people experimenting on themselves and self-reporting.
Okay.
I mean, I guess it's kind of akin to the philosophical zombie argument. Like, how can you tell just by looking at somebody's behavior or even looking at activity in the brain whether that person is having a subjective experience, sentience, or consciousness?
That seems like a really weird argument to me. Like,
if you look at an animal and they have eyes, and they're similar in biology to our eyes, and they seem to look around, you can only infer is that they're probably seeing something.
well, I guess what I struggle with the idea of philosophical zombies is if there are people who behave like a conscious person in every way but are not themselves conscious, it would appear that they would have to have some other kind of mechanism that allows them to simulate consciousness. And that is a defeater for the whole concept, because the whole concept is that there could be people that are philosophical zombies around us. At least that's the difficulty. That may be the wrong way of approaching the problem, but that's the way I think of it. That's the only way I know to think about it.
I mean, the problem with the philosophical zombie is that we're positing we have the same biology and everything, but without conscious experience. And, conscious experience is based in how we can do it about experience.
Right.
And if they have the same biology, they're going to probably have the same type of experience. So,
Yeah, it seems like an unjustified assumption.
Okay, well, let me give maybe not quite philosophical zombie, but another example. So sometimes when I'm reading, I find that I flip through a bunch of pages and my mind starts wandering and I think about something else, yet somehow I'm still making progress through the book. Yet I don't remember anything that I've read.
Right, because the parts of you that process the words and read them to you in your brain, if the conscious part of you is not paying attention, well, it's not paying attention, but that part's still working. In the same way that you can't really shut down your hearing or your smelling while you're...
So I guess I would compare being able to do things like moving your eyes without consciously being aware of it. That might be possible.
but it's an association, so when you're driving, so you realize you haven't been paying attention for the last 2 years. Somehow you still
yet you wouldn't accuse somebody who drove home from work that way as being a zombie. You would just say that they were, not that one part of their brain was being, kind of resting.
Well, and usually you're lost in thought, right? And that's that thing too.
Yeah.
Right.
I suppose the only way we're going to be able to figure out who's a philosophical zombie is everybody's going to have to be operated on for brain surgery to make sure there's really a living human brain underneath that skull. Is that right?
That sounds good.
How would we tell?
Don't philosophical zombies have brains also?
I'm not sure. It sounds like it's a good thought experiment.
Well, as I just illustrated, a thought experiment is better than a real experiment.
Much cheaper, too.
I mean, the test we use now to determine whether somebody is conscious is to try to get them to react to something, and if they don't react, then we assume that they're not perceiving anything. Yeah, I mean, this is what like a doctor would do to determine if somebody that's gone under anesthesia is conscious or not.
Remind me of the overall concern of this line of thinking. Like, why would it be important to talk about philosophical zombies in the context right now?
I think the overall question is how do we determine what is conscious and what isn't conscious? What is consciousness? What causes consciousness? And is it something more than just the physical world?
Well, that seems to fall in the case of one of those things that is not absolutely knowable or very knowable. I mean, we kind of have to, we have no absolute certainty that on the other side of the moon that atoms behave the same way as they do here right in front of us in our microscopes, or maybe on the other side of the universe. We can't get there and find it out. I think the other side of the universe is probably better than the moon. But it's just one of those things that we're like, well, they're behaving like a person. It would be weird to not treat them like a person, so I'm going to.
I disagree. I don't think it's unknowable for ourselves to figure out, okay, these particular brain patterns result in consciousness and these particular ones don't, and here's the mechanism by which we can tell one from the other. And if you can get the explanation that far, then that might be enough to determine which other kinds of brains would be conscious and which would not.
Okay, I think maybe I took the concern wrongly. Okay, that makes sense.
To give another example, like, we don't know why it is that mass and energy bend space-time. Like, we have an equation to describe it, general relativity. You have this concentration of mass and energy, therefore you have this curvature of space-time. We don't know why it is that those things are linked in the way that they are.
Mm-hmm.
So, could you prove to me that I'm not a philosophical zombie? Is there something that I'm experiencing? Let's assume that for the sake of just beginning, we'll assume that you and I are both conscious, all of us are conscious, and we can observe that we are conscious. What do we observe that would allow me to tell that I am conscious as opposed to just going through the motions of consciousness?
I don't think you have to prove to anybody that they're conscious because they already experience it. It would be more like I would need to prove to Mark that you juggling are conscious.
I'm asking you to prove it to me first, because what is it that I'm actually, I mean, it's just a thought question. What is it that I'm actually experiencing that proves to me that what is this thing?
If you're experiencing anything, you are conscious.
Okay.
Experience, that is conscious.
The fact that you spoke some words means you're conscious, right?
Well,
so does the fact that my rooster is coming over here for attention say that my rooster is...
No, but the fact that you experience a rooster coming is proof to you that you are conscious.
So I'm the only one who could prove that I'm unconscious or not.
So far.
I think technically that's correct.
Okay.
But I think we could get to the point where we could determine reliably who is conscious and who isn't.
Yeah, we have a strong inference that, like, I have a strong inference that all of you are conscious, even if I can't prove it absolutely to 100%.
Well, like in other words, breathing doesn't mean you're conscious, right?
Right.
Agreed.
Okay, what?
No experience.
Let me try to frame this differently. Or try to see if I can get the big picture. So it seems what DJ is suggesting, like it seems to be the case that the only person who truly can be certain that they are aware is the person themselves, because they are the only one that can experience that awareness. However, our science could get so good that we are able to recognize how to switch consciousness on and off, and what structures of the brain, or how the structures of the brain collectively create consciousness. And so we can map that out, and we can say, if you have these structures, you are conscious. And so there's a sense in which we can do that with science, but there is still a kind of experiential evidence that is required. It's kind of like, I look at that data, I recognize that applies to me and that I have experience, and therefore I can use that data to determine if you have experience. But it seems intuitive to me that there is still a kind of assumption involved in that, which is the veracity of our scientific process itself, which I find compelling, but not any more certain than whether or not other people have self-awareness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the issue is getting rid of the requirement for certainty. That's the solution to the problem. Happy with induction.
Yes.
I think we may get to the point where we understand what conditions are necessary and sufficient for consciousness, and maybe the mechanism that produces it, but never get an answer to why the universe is that way, that this certain configuration or process results in a subjective experience. I think it may be akin to my example with gravity. We don't have an explanation yet of why mass curves space-time, but we can, predict very reliably, how much gravity is going to be in a particular location.
Does consciousness make any predictions?
Consciousness itself? I mean, consciousness is just the capacity to have experience.
Yeah. So somebody who can't hear, can't see, and can't speak, how are we going to test to see whether or not they're conscious?
Well, if we understood enough about our own brains and what process in our brains is linked to consciousness, then we could tell that way whether that person is conscious. And there's already been things done where they rely on a person being able to respond to a request. Let's see, you said they couldn't hear, they couldn't see.
Couldn't speak and couldn't see.
Can they feel? Can they sense anything?
Yeah, they still have a nervous system.
I mean, if you can communicate with them in some way, then you could ask them to think about something in response. And this has been done with patients who are locked in. They're asked to do things like, imagine yourself playing tennis, or imagine yourself cleaning your house, and then they see that there's a correlation between what they've asked the person to imagine and what's going on in their brain. And so then experimenters infer from that yes, this person is able to hear and understand what we're saying, even if they can't speak or move in response.
I think there might be a cool thing right there. That means we sort of have a test, and consciousness could be tied to whether you could take in abstract information and build a model, or build an imagination that is a process you could dream or make.
Well, if you've seen the movie Tommy with Roger Daltrey, you know that the test for consciousness of that kind of person would be whether or not they can play pinball really well.
Ah, yes. Wow. Yeah, I think that's the, what do we call it? Psychological blindness. What was the kind of blindness? There's where you're not actually blind, but the conscious part of you can't receive the information, but yet other parts of your brain do, and you can walk through a room and avoid things, but you're not consciously aware of seeing. I don't know what that's called.
Blind sight, maybe?
That sounds right.
So I forget who it was who said this a few minutes ago, but why should we care about who is conscious and who isn't? I wonder if that is a moral and ethical question, because, well, I know Harry's defended this in past conversations, and today's not here to talk about it again, but this idea of morality being about the experience of conscious beings.
Yeah, in some ways, the only thing we care about is who is conscious and who isn't.
Peter Singer says that morality should be about, suffering. So if something can suffer, that's an indication that we need to be concerned about, their experience in that context. If they can't feel, if there's no suffering involved, like dropping a brick, if the brick doesn't suffer as a result, then it's not immoral to drop a brick.
Now, if we ended up concluding based on our studies that bacteria are conscious, I think we might not necessarily change our morality to adjust for that and adjust for the feelings of bacteria.
We'd probably just try to silence Peter Singer, is what we'd do.
Yeah, beer drinkers would have a real hard time if yeast turned out to be moral towards.
Well, but then I guess whether we should be humane, so to speak, I think we should eat animals. We probably shouldn't torture them.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's an argument to be made that what is conscious, or how do I say this? It's not merely that a being feels pain that should be our ethical decision not to inflict pain upon them. It is, what does it say about us that we are willing to inflict that pain on them? I think that has to enter into the equation as well.
So the Punisher, saying this hurts me more than it hurts you.
Maybe. I mean, that's kind of that still asks the question of whether punishment is a good idea or not, whether it actually has usefulness, to use that word. I guess I just mean that there is, oh gosh, how do I say this? We got to be careful what kind of assumptions we're making about what another being experiences. Are we saying, well, I wouldn't want to have that happen to me, therefore we should make sure that doesn't happen to the animals. And for instance, I've heard really good arguments that animals in zoos actually have a much happier quality of life than those in the wild, because no one, they are most animals are territorial, and the territory of the animal is well established by the environment, and they're just calm and they're happy because nobody's messing with their environment. Whereas it's very easy for us to go, well, I wouldn't want to be in a cage. Now, that's probably different than simply talking about pain itself, but I do think that's a part of the conversation.
That reminds me of juggling chickens. I think you said juggling that they don't mind confinement at all.
Yeah.
The kind I have are very well suited to close confinement. And some people keep them in little tiny cages, and that seems to work out okay for them. I don't. I let them have the free run of the boat.
Was that a turn of phrase, or do you live on a boat?
I live on a boat.
That's awesome.
It's a 46 foot long trimaran, 5.5.
You are a fantastic human being. I love it.
Oh, thank you. And my living on a boat doesn't make me a better human.
Well, it makes you very interesting.
I know this is off topic, juggling, but what was the thought process through to decide to basically go off of land and become and to live on a boat? I mean, there was some motivation. There must have been some reasons why you decided that was a good idea.
Sure. So let me go back and say maybe 15 years ago, I got together with my husband, and then we've since then collected 2 wives. And he's had a long desire to have a boat and wants to retire to the ocean. So one day he said, "Oh, there's a thing I want to check out," and took me to this marina. And he and one of my wives went out to go see it. I stayed on shore because there wasn't enough room on the dinghy. And he wrote a check before I got a chance to see the boat. And my showing up was unimportant. As it turned out, he decided to without me. Okay, fine. So he decided and bought a boat without me. And it's a real fixer-upper. And I ended up being the one that was available and capable of working on the boat. And I also found I had great benefit from having a couple of days of solitude every week. That was really important. Not more than 4 days at a stretch, then I go crazy, but if I get 2 or 3 days of solitude in a row, I do really well with myself. So I'm living on the boat. That's how I do it. The actual acquisition of the boat was not my choice, and my husband's much more motivated toward it than I am. And
Wow. So I've been kind of...
Big decisions made without
I remember that day I'm sitting over there at the picnic table on the shore side, and Kimberly comes back and says, "Yeah, Boyle wrote a check," and I'm slapping the table going, "He didn't let me see the boat. He brought me out here. There's no reason. What's the?" And our other wife was in Colorado, and it was a little out of control, but it's okay. He can spend his money. It's allowed.
So I've been perusing through the book as we talk, and I think the most interesting point I've seen that I somehow missed my first reading through it is in chapter 43, where he's talking about let's see here, where is it? But we get into trouble if we try to say that phenomenon in one theory are caused by phenomenon in a different one. I know that I cannot use my mental powers to reach across space and... no, that's not it. Shoot, sorry. He was talking about use of different languages on different levels. So, which seems to be an extremely important conversation to have and figure out. Here it is. Rather than acknowledging that there is one way of talking about the world in terms of the quantum fields and interactions of the core theory, and another way in terms of electrochemical signals traveling between cells, and yet another way in terms of human agents with desires and mental states, we fall into the trap of using multiple vocabularies at the same time. And I guess I'm wondering what kind of conclusions you guys think you have arrived at about that issue, or what
Well, I
conclusion.
disagree with Sean Carroll on this. I think you can talk about things on multiple levels interacting and not necessarily get into trouble with that.
Okay.
So I'd give an example. So one would be Schrodinger's cat experiment, where you've got some quantum event like radioactive decay resulting in, possibly a really bad consequence for the macroscopic cat. Another example in reverse would be you've got engineers at IBM using this tiny molecular tip to rearrange atoms on a plate to draw out pictures of things. An example of decisions being made on a macroscopic level affecting something on a microscopic level.
Yeah, I think you can use the vocabulary from these different levels of abstraction, but I just think it makes your explanation maybe a little more complicated. Like if you were to try to describe World War I in terms of atoms crashing into each other, that would be that'd be a very tough book to write about World War I. It'd be a lot easier just to write about Germany, France, Russia, Great Britain. It's a lot easier to write that way, at that level of abstraction, than to try to maneuver back and forth. Although you could have a chapter in your book on World War I about the advances in weaponry and what sort of scientific explanations lie behind those advances. So I guess I agree with you, GJ. You can make the jump. It's just something that people, when they do it, they sometimes make mistakes.
Yeah, I'm perusing his book again, that same chapter, and it looks to me like he just kind of decides finally that, okay, I guess there's not really a problem. I don't see any other kind of conclusion he comes to. But then I have a hard time reading him.
3XK is saying you can talk about things on multiple levels, but it can get overcomplicated. It is more useful to establish points on the way so you don't have to talk about chemistry using quarks.
Right, though sometimes you may want to have a specific discussion where you are comparing and contrasting like the forest from trees and seeing them together. But most of the time it makes sense to talk about the forest when we're talking about trees.
So
I think it's interesting that. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Well, I'm fascinated by this because to me, I have the hope that we can kind of become aware of this multiple level problem and develop a language that, almost how the German language is supposed to be extremely precise and specific in certain situations. If we could develop a language that was precise about the levels you're on, would the problem go away then?
I don't know if it'd go away. What pops into my head is a discussion a couple people had, and where someone asked someone else, how do you get democracy from atoms and molecules? And of course, trying to, the guy reacted saying, you don't. That's a lower level of abstraction. When you're going to talk about democracy, you're going to talk about human beings. You're going to talk about in the language of political science, not in the language of physics. And I think that's correct. I think you have to be willing to accept a higher level of abstraction if you're going to talk intelligently about things like that, about democracy or dictatorship or monarchy or what have you.
Yeah, that seems right to me. Does
I can talk about dopamine and serotonin while talking about politics.
And I don't think that atoms are necessary for democracy. I mean, we have these higher levels that we know what the lower levels are that they emerge from, but they could also emerge from a different set of lower levels. You could have the same emergent behavior.
This
The way I
actually,
always put it is, it depends on what the questioner asks you, what level of abstraction you want to look at. So,
yeah. I had a note that this reminds me of. I was noticing that I felt like he was getting stuck on one layer of analysis through a lot of what he was saying. Here it is. It seems to me that there's a difference between a science of abstract laws, of our description of physics and the physical, and a science of the present order of the physical, meaning what order atoms are in. Like, that's more of, that doesn't seem to necessarily be what science does. Science seems to be about establishing what happens in certain circumstances. Sometimes that happens to do with the order of things, but then they are trying to glean a general principle from that. So it seems to me that we have to be careful, because sometimes when we're talking about a scientific theory, we're not actually at all talking about the structure things happen to be in. That is another layer that we have to be aware of. Does that make sense?
Right. I think that's like the separation of a physical law from the boundary conditions or initial conditions.
Could you say more about that?
Well, the physical laws by themselves don't determine the exact arrangement of things, so you have to
yes.
plug in some boundary conditions and then run the law based on that.
Right. That's what I think of as emergent systems. This idea that when you have a system, when things are in a very particular order, moving in a particular way, and out of that you have an effect that emerges that can only happen in the universe if you have things in that general structure. Does that sound like the same kind of idea?
Possibly. I mean, I'm just thinking of like some different equations of physics, like, okay, let's take like Newtonian dynamics. Well, you still have to specify positions and velocities for whatever particles they're going to be and where they're located, and that's not specified by the equations for Newtonian physics. That's some sort of boundary condition or initial condition that you have to plug into the equations.
Right. Okay. So I'm just thinking about how we can observe the state of matter of a particle and develop our theories of how that particle behaves, but it seems like it's a very different level of analysis when we say observe the way a car operates and the efficiency of it versus the lack of inefficiency and durability and those kind of things. Those seem to be not so much about how atoms, although it's made of atoms and those atoms are doing atom things, it's not about that. It's about the emergence of a car out of atoms. Does that make sense?
I guess to give an example along your car, let's say you're talking about analyzing traffic patterns, and how is it that like you get these wave-like patterns of going slowly, going faster as the cars are piling up in traffic. And you could do that, you can simulate that without having atoms at all. You could just have, like each car represented in your simulation as some sort of particle of its own that has, velocity and responds to other particles around it. And you would get the same sort of traffic pattern and traffic backups as you would of simulating, the entire steel frame and its structure and such.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost as if I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot about my own ideas here, but I'm grateful to be able to think through them outside my own head. Um, I it seems to me that we have these levels of emergence, and we can take advantage of those levels when we know how they work. But in general life, you have all the levels of emergence that build up to the experience we have of living our lives in reality. When we can analyze those lower levels, then we can make things like cars and atomic bombs and things like that, uh, and all the mathematical principles that seem to somehow be embedded in the nature of the universe itself. But it's not always appropriate to use that language, because that language is, in a sense, it's a part of the whole. Whereas as a human being trying to live their life, I'm observing a different part of the whole. And so there's a huge drop off in the importance of that data. Although it goes into making the layer of reality I'm on, we have to jump to different forms of language, because those different forms of language are describing different levels of reality, different systems in action. And I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess for the most part, I ignore the fact that I'm a creature made of cells. So, while I know that certain things are happening to me because of cellular processes, it's not a way that I need to be thinking of myself most of the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if I were not made of cells, if I were made of silicon, but still had the same basic experiences, then, I would say that nothing that substantial has changed for me.
Looks like Mark took off on us. The last chapter is free will. Do we want to go into any free will discussion before we end this, or is that just too big of an issue to get into? Or, well, I guess we could at least say what he thinks free will is.
I'm game for discussing it if anybody else would like to.
I'm happy to.
My position on free will is compatibilism. So, and I would say determinism. So I think our sense of free will and choice, like I was saying before, comes down to imagining possible futures and then selecting from those, even though our selection process is deterministic, or possibly due to random factors that we have no control over. We don't sense that. We don't have an awareness of the underlying mechanism by which our minds work. So we do conceive of possible futures and see ourselves making a choice among them.
I guess our main proponent of determinism left earlier, huh? Is that the case? Or are we all compatibilists here? I think we're all compatibilists.
I'm not sure. I'm a bit of a non-determinist, and I think my free will is trivial but not profound. Does that make me happy?
Well, juggling, when you say not determinist, you're just saying that you might be buffeted by randomness, but you really have no control over that randomness?
I don't have any control over the randomness, but I'm of the mind that even a chess computer makes choices, and so do I. I have those trivial kinds of choices. I can do all I can choose from amongst the choices that I thought of, and I obviously can't do anything that I didn't think of first. It's a pretty soft free will, and
Yeah.
I am a not hard determinist. I'm okay with soft determinism in the sense that at the classical level, very much we can build clockworky things that are very clockworky. So sure.
That's very
Well,
interesting.
I agree with you, Juggling, that like my belief in hard determinism is not really justified at this point, given what we know about quantum mechanics. We haven't settled on a deterministic theory of that. So, but I think it doesn't really matter in the end whether at the quantum level things are deterministic or indeterministic, as long as it's not something that we have top-down control over. The effect is going to be the same when it comes to free will.
So,
Yeah, I put it is determined subject to possible random. That just seems to be
so I like to make an argument for, I guess, what I think of as weak versus strong free will. Although I like the term self-determinism because I think it narrows down into what I think is actually happening. So I'm curious, Juggling, would you say you could be more free with more information about yourself in the world, or would you be just as unfree as if you were rather ignorant and misunderstanding of the way the world works?
Oh, interesting. Okay, so if I understand the world better, I can better predict it. So I'm going to come up with more options,
Yeah.
or I'm going to come up with less options, but I'll prefer the ones I come up with because they will be more representative of me predicting reality based upon my actions. So I would much prefer to know more, even if it reduces my choices, because it's the kind of choices I wanted to reduce down to anyway.
Yeah.
So what if you had enough information? Let's say you had information about the future, so you knew what decision you would eventually make. Would you then feel that you were not freely making those decisions?
Oh, I'm freely making the decision to constrain myself to the best choice. Basically, what I'm doing is saying, okay, at the end of a careful, long analysis, what would be my choice? That I'm making that careful, long analysis is my free will, and then I'm subjecting myself to the results of that choice. Like if I were to think about chess, the longer I think about it, might reduce the number of moves I'm willing to make as opposed to increase them at any given point.
Yeah, I would say talk about it in terms of I am not free from myself in the moment, but I am free to reimagine and work towards that self over time. I like to call it chronologically dense. So instead of, in the moment I have very little freedom, but over time through the creating a density of chronological choices and observations of myself and processing of my options, then I begin to develop freedom there.
I guess what you're describing, Matthew, sounds a lot like self-modifying code. That you're modifying your own algorithm for the future.
Yeah.
And, of course, our own internal algorithms are always self-modifying. Like we're always, reweighting our synaptic connections and reforming memories as we remember them, as someone reminded me recently.
So I guess the question would then be, to what extent is our conscious awareness merely a freeloader along this process, or to what degree does it actually participate and direct the process?
I think that freeloader may be biased in the wrong way. It's more this is the mechanism by which your free will works.
Yes.
So you own that mechanism, and so that is part of you, and it's not like you're at the mercy of it. That is just your internal workings by which you can make decisions and improve yourself.
But by saying will, I mean, we're by definition talking about a conscious expression. It's something that we're aware that is our intention, right? Isn't that what the will is?
Yeah, I'd go with that definition.
Yeah. We might not be all aware on how we came to that choice or even why we choose the particular choice we are, but we definitely choose it. We definitely have a will and desire and a mental fixation on that as the choice.
Yeah, like I think consciousness on its own doesn't determine whether it's free or not. Like, for example, we look at something, we don't have a choice. Whether we have a conscious experience of it. So consciousness itself is not free. So the question is, so we have will, which is a conscious experience. The question is it free or not free? Yeah. So the consciousness is separate from the free.
That's right. When you see a sequence of moving images, or a sequence of images that are presented to you rapidly enough, you can't help but see a moving animation. Once it gets past a certain speed, frame rate. That's not something that you have any conscious choice over.
That's interesting you make that point. This may be a digression, but there is some low-quality animation I've watched in my life, and I find I can switch back and forth between watching it as a series of images or as a continuous flow, depending on how I adjust my awareness to the film.
That sounds pretty interesting. I think you would be unable to do that, though, once you got past a certain frame rate.
Yeah, I think that's definitely correct.
I gotta go, guys, but
Yeah.
thanks, it was good.
I think I got to go too, guys.
Yeah. Thanks for the discussion.
Thank you all.